Okay, so welcome to a special series of videos at the Healing Metrics Online. Today we have a very special guest, but we don't have to go very far. He's an in-house guest. He's my fellow co-founder, Hans-Günter Kern. Hans, welcome to the show.
Hi, pleased to be here with you and
Thank
all
you.
your listeners out there.
Yes, thank you. And so I'm very excited, Hans. So if you don't mind sort of me explaining to the audience, we have decided to put together a video series on growing your own food. And we intend this to be a perennial series of videos where people can make use of it to grow their own food. But we are particularly recording this now in March 2020, right in the middle of the coronavirus outbreak. And one of the things that people are facing at the moment is that the supermarket shelves are a bit bare and there's very little food around. We are an island. Here in the UK, a lot of our food comes from countries like Spain and Italy, which are in total lockdown, and we have no idea how things are going to be affected in terms of getting food in future and so on. So we think it's a good thing anyway, but I think particularly at this moment, it may be quite wise to start thinking about growing your own food. And so, Hans, you are perfectly suited to guide us through it and guide our listeners through it. You have a wealth of experience in biodynamic gardening. You have taught and you teach internationally, and you have you're such a fountain of knowledge when it comes to gardening and growing your own food. So, Hans, I think the first question I would want to ask you is, I think people are quite clear on the differences between conventional farming or conventional gardening and organic gardening, i.e. not using pesticides and growing things naturally without any additives and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about what biodynamic gardening is and how it is different from organic gardening?
So just to say that there are quite a lot of organic gardeners who do more than what you just said. If they have a consciousness of, healing the earth and being real stewards to the earth, or stewardesses, or whatever you want to call it, custodians. Because traditionally, you could say that the organic gardening movement has basically done away with chemical fertilizers, with the pesticides, fungicides that are petrochemical based, and have replaced them with natural means of fertilizing the plants, preventing pests, etc. They're using also techniques which are very traditional, like companion planting, interplanting, and using herbs and flowers to repel the pests. And of course the crop rotation, which avoids any soil-borne pests, which then we could say we share all those fundamental traditional, organic, and also conventional practices of being aware of soil chemistry, being aware of all the interactions between the plants and the soil, meteorology, because we need to be aware of the weather. That's all shared with those two types of gardening and farming. But I would say what really was added with biodynamic farming is the consciousness of healing the earth with herbal remedies, with a consciousness of really working with the rhythms of nature. That's both in terms of the year rhythm, the monthly rhythm of the moon, you could say, the daily rhythm of the earth breathing in and out, which then makes a huge difference in terms of plants' ripeness and readiness to be harvested to create the best nutritious quality for our health. And beyond that, we're seeing a biodynamic garden or farm, not just the soil or the climate and the natural environment around us. We see it also very connected with the cosmic influences, whatever you want to call those, the universal intelligence that flows through the starry energy and information, light energy that comes in, which is then modulated by the planetary sphere, which are the planets and particularly the moon. And we work with those rhythms also, which I would assume that some organic farmers include that nowadays, the moon rhythms. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to planetary rhythms and then, for example, sowing, depending when the moon is in which constellation of the zodiac, not many organic farmers practice. This is a mainstay of biodynamic gardening. And so creating that real connection with the cosmos, with the universe, with this universal intelligence again, so we can say we're really informing all parts of our being and nourish the spirit, the soul, the biological body, and the physical body. Whereas I could say, and dare say here, conventional farming is only filling your hump and nourishing your physical body. Organic farming is mostly nourishing your physical and your biological body, but not filling your soul and your spirit. And I think that's where we are seeing, when we listen to people, the biggest downfall in why people actually fall ill and have chronic illnesses, because they're not living their life to the full, they don't know who they are, and they're not really living their true spirit. They're not inspired. Inspired meaning inspirited. So if those parts of our being are not nourished, which we can do with biodynamic practices, then we don't have the power really to be whole. Then we are just part of who we really could be.
Okay, thank you, Hans. And so, you know, I want this to be quite a practical sort of interview, so that people can, you know, our listeners and our audience can have a sense of having got some information to get out there and start planting and start sort of gardening. And so hopefully we can give a lot of practical information and so on. So when somebody's about to start their garden, and of course I know that you will say to me that what kind of garden you create and so on will depend on your needs and how many people you're gardening for, and whether you're doing this as a community or whatever. I was assuming, but again, this may be a wrong assumption, but I would be assuming that most of our listeners may live in a property with a garden, with their private garden, and they may be thinking about turning their own garden into a vegetable patch. So I am assuming from what you're saying that you would absolutely recommend, if they were to start gardening now, that they do it the biodynamic way rather than just the organic way.
I would highly recommend that, because that will not just heal themselves, the soil of their garden, but all the natural environment around, because it reaches out far beyond your own garden and yourself. And I think that's what we need right now, to take care not just of our own garden, but the wider environment. So absolutely, yeah. And I would also add, if you go, well, I haven't got any land, I have only got a small patch where I can't grow all my vegetable, needs in terms of consumption. Even if you start in a plant pot on the windowsill, it will make a difference in the way you feel, in the way that you make a contribution already for your children to learn how to do these things. So if you've got a patio, a pot garden or plant a garden, anything you can do really to add, to produce crops in this holistic way, I think you will make a huge contribution to humanity at this moment.
Okay, thank you. And so I guess one last question related to that before we move on to the how-to bit. In terms of the cost, the additional cost that biodynamic would take in terms of the monetary cost and also the energy or the labor, is there a big difference?
I would say there's no difference to organic gardening or farming, because basically in organic farming and gardening you have to buy amendments, concentrated organic fertilizers, either liquid or solid, and they're very expensive. We use the herbal preparations that we add to the compost or to the soil, or we spray the plants themselves to regulate the plant growth in the maturing process, and they're I would say dirt cheap, because we use minimal quantities that are almost in homeopathic quantities. And besides that, we have the capacity of avoiding having to use organic pesticides, organic weed killers that also exist, like vinegar and such things, because we can again deal with those things in a homeopathic way, which basically can be made at home and don't cost anything. They might take a couple of hours to prepare preparation, but I assume that the next 3 months we have all plenty of time.
Yes. Well, I would.
So we can save money.
Yeah.
I would say we can save money short term and long term, because we're actually making use of the resources we have at hand. All we need is the knowledge and the know-how how to apply these practices that we will go into more detail later.
Okay, great. Thank you. So you may want to say, as we go along, you may want to say more things about different types of farming and different purposes. But if we assume, for example, that just to make it more concrete, let's assume I am a listener. I have just listened to what you said, and I'm thinking, yeah, I need to create a biodynamic garden. So I live in a home with a little front garden and a slightly bigger back garden. So in my front garden, I have maybe a 2x3 patch or something like that. In my back garden, I may have something like 3x3 meters. So we're talking about 9 square meters and 6 square meters or something. Where do I start? Okay, I'm going to do my garden. Where do I start?
The first thing I would ask you to look at is, how is the location of those two plots in relationship to trees and houses around you? Because I think the main important thing, particularly with trees, is we have to be staying away from the root zone of the trees. Because I have a lot of experience myself over the years growing too close to roots, and you will never grow a successful vegetable crop because the tree roots will compete for water and nutrients with your vegetables. So do you have any trees overhanging those areas, or how far are they away?
So in my front garden, I have an acacia tree, which is probably a meter or a meter and a half from the potential patch. In my back garden, I've got a couple of fir trees that may be further away.
Okay. So now you started distinguishing between the acacia, which is a leguminous plant, which might be actually beneficial for your growing because they got legume bacteria, which accumulates nitrogen free of charge to enrich your soil with nitrogen, which grows bigger crops usually. So there's an advantage possibly. Whereas in the back garden, if you talk about coniferous trees and hedges, particularly, all of you are aware of the Leylandi hedge, cypress hedge, and their roots are very shallow and they reach out a long way. So you could basically say, if you look at the hedge and the height, and then measure the distance from the actual hedge away, that's about as far as the roots will reach, and they will terribly deplete your soil because they're competing right in the topsoil area with your garden. So stay away from those far enough. And then maybe have structures there like, put your greenhouse or put your garden shed. You can't even put the compost there because the roots will grow into the compost. But any structures that are permanent or paths, put them in those areas.
Right. Okay. So for people who have a different structure, they don't have the same trees that I do, what would you say to them? Stay away from most trees?
So basically, if you think of the tree and the crown of the tree and the sides of the tree where the branches finish, you would basically have to stay about 1 meter or 1.5 meters away from what's called the drip line, where all the water runs off on the leaves on the outside of the trees, and the feeder roots will reach out and penetrate the root with their fine capillary system 1 meter or 1.5 meters away and compete with your vegetables. That's the worst area to grow your vegetables. But you could possibly use the area under the tree close to the trunk for shade-loving vegetables, because the thick roots of the tree, they don't have any fine roots to take nutrients away. So on top of those, you have no competition just for light. So in summer, it might be nice to have shade-loving plants that can grow under the tree and also put your compost under the trees. So maybe we can make use of the deciduous trees, not conifers. They're like much too dense and shading too much.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I think what I'm getting from that is mostly if you stay away from trees altogether, then you minimize competition and everything else. And if you don't know the benefits that certain trees can bring and the damage that other trees can cause, then if you stay away from them altogether, then that's kind of safe. Then if you are closer to trees, then you then look into what sort of trees there are and whether they may hinder or promote growth or whatever. Yeah,
absolutely. And then the next thing would be to look at shading in general in terms of the path of the sun.
Yeah.
So being aware where's the sun rising for you, where's east, and then of course in winter the arc of the sun is very low. In spring it's sort of medium high, in summer it's very high. and assess if you have trees, for example, on the western side and on the eastern side of your plot that are very high. That's more disadvantageous than if you have trees in the southern side of your garden, which then shade out the midday sun, which is very bright and strong and drying and kind of baking the soil and the plants. Whereas the morning and afternoon sun are much more gentle and enhancing the growth of your plants. So that's another consideration to bear in mind.
Yeah. So essentially, you want some shade in the hot times of the day, like the middle of the day, particularly in the summer, the spring and the summer, and so on. And then you want as much sun as you can at the beginning, at the end of the day.
Preferably a speckled shade with deciduous trees, leafy trees, rather than conifers that are very thick and create a solid shade. So just to distinguish that. Yeah. Okay. So I've chosen my plot. Then I've got my plot. It's in the right location, and I've got the shade and so on. Then what? So another aspect of your environment would be, we've looked at the light distribution. Rain is something we can't manipulate, unfortunately, or fortunately, because everybody would have different opinion. We would fight with each other. So that we look at in a minute in terms of water supply. But the other thing that's very essential is, where's your main wind direction?
Wind direction.
Wind direction, because what we know from creating a natural, organic, biodynamic growing environment is that we're creating, with this rich soil that usually we have under the plants that we're growing, emanation of CO2 from the soil organisms, and that CO2 is enhancing the growth of the vegetables being taken up by the leaves much more readily than the other CO2 which is in the air already. So we call that a growth atmosphere. If that's blown away consistently, then that growth atmosphere is being destroyed. Also, if there's too much exposure, for example, in spring, when the soil is supposed to warm up, the soil delays in warming up, and we want to protect that. So we want hedging that's deciduous plants, again, preferably, that break the wind. There's still ventilation, because we don't want stagnant air either. So nice balance between the right ventilation, but also the breaking of the wind, not the stopping of the wind with walls, because that creates turbulences. And having that in place, you have a cooler environment in the summer, because your hedges are creating like a refrigeration effect and cooling the environment. And the other one is that we have the winter or spring period, where we will find that the environment is being kept warmer and more protected. So we find that actually in practice we have a 5 degrees difference in terms of extreme temperatures and minimum temperatures, extends the growing season and helps plants to grow better in summer.
Okay, so we've taken into consideration the sun, we've taken into consideration trees, we've taken into consideration the wind, and are we ready now to choose the plot?
So the plot is of great importance, because that's maybe our most limiting factor, but our most potentially beneficial factor, which is the soil and the bedrock. So you want to be aware what soil is under your feet, which we don't usually look at. We walk on it, but we don't look at it.
Yeah. And so I'm thinking that many people, again, will be confined to whatever they have in the garden. So yes, ideally, I think if I were to purchase the land, or if I were to think about where do I want to grow my vegetables, I would have a lot more choice than if I am in my own house. So in my own house, I've got the trees that I've got, and unless I want to do something dramatic in that sense, we are thinking about how people can start growing their own food. I've got the trees that I've got, so I would take into account the sun. I would take into account the trees in that I can stay a bit further away from them. But everything else, I guess I'd have to work with what I have, including the quality of the soil.
Absolutely, and whatever quality you have, you can improve.
Yeah. Okay.
So with the soil, we want to be most aware to start with before we even start to look at the weeds or the wild herbs that are growing in that area. If it's a lawn, that might be a bit more difficult, but you want to then look at the lawn and the color of the leaves of the lawn because that gives you an indication of the fertility level of that area in the soil.
Right.
And the greener the grass, obviously, and the faster it grows, the more often you mow that lawn, and you might want to turn that into your garden. You know you've got a nice fertility there. If you start digging in that lawn and take a block of soil out from the topsoil, which is the darker colored soil, before you hit the light colored soil, which is called the subsoil, then you'll see how many earthworms you got in that soil. Like maybe a cutting of a spade width, a block you take out and you break it up and you look at the earthworm count. If you have 3 to 5 earthworms, it shows you pretty much you've got a hugely fertile soil with a lot of fertility, which suits itself very well for gardening. You won't need to compost much to actually have your first year of crop. Now, if you have no earthworms, that might mean you have to actually start looking, either you have already a kitchen compost, or you might have in the first year to import a bulk bag of compost that you can order online. And I imagine there's still deliveries at this moment, but if you don't have any compost and there are no deliveries, then you have to just work with what you got.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess there was a bit of a lip in there. So once I've got the plots, then are you saying you take the first, so at the moment, if you've got a lawn like many people may have, then it's all, there's grass. And so are you suggesting that we then take the top layer off?
Absolutely. Take what's called the sod off, or the turf. Okay. And it's the old English saying "sod it," because people are really tired of sodding, getting the turf off, because it's very hard to get that off. Because basically, if you've got grass growing, you got soil pests there. They're called wireworms, and they eat your roots of your lettuces and other finer roots of your veggie crops. So people get very angry about the grass. And if you have any grass in the garden, then you will have those soil pests in the soil. And they're little caterpillars, basically, the orange colored caterpillars. Yes. So you take the top inch usually off. The easiest way to take that off, and I was going to say something about the tools you need in the garden. It's very essentially have the primary tools that you need for gardening. So some people do that with a spade. You would certainly need a really good metal file to sharpen your spade. But if you do it with a spade, it's really hard back-breaking work. And that's why the farmers always used to say sod it, because they might have not had a hoe. You've got a heavy hoe, and you can get your hands on a heavy Chillington hoe, like the Africans or all these other, so-called developing countries have. You back pain free and just skim that soil off with your hoe. And then anything that you skim off, you can make actually directly a compost, which in half a year, you have beautiful humus-rich soil from the root region and from the leaves. You set it up with some lime or wood ash if you've got a wood burner, and you get that beautiful, rich, humus-rich, nice structured, fertile, crumbly soil that you want in a garden. And then, of course, you have taken this rich soil off and you're left with a bit of a poorer soil. Next step would be, before you even start taking it off, to line out where do you actually want to have the garden, obviously. And then once you have taken it off, decide, well, where am I going to put the beds and how am I going to orientate my garden beds? So again, the best orientation for garden beds would be north-south, because then both sides of the bed get the equal exposure to sun and air and everything during the course of the day. If you can't do that...
So if you got them from north to south, then they would get some sun from the east in the morning and then some from the west in the evening. Right.
Exactly. Okay. And then in the middle of the day, the plants sort of shade each other and protect each other. Now, you might have the house on the east side and you only have midday and afternoon sun. It might be an idea to orientate your garden slightly your garden bed slightly southwest. So you get more even distribution of light during midday to afternoon sun. But that's just up to your own artistic capacity to sort of balance out the light in the garden. And for your plants.
I'm assuming from that then the beds would be sort of in a slight mount, and there would be some little mountains and valleys, basically.
Okay. We're not doing screen sharing, but if I show this.
Yes.
Is this clear? Yeah, that's just one of the possibilities of creating a a hilled up bed, a raised bed.
Yes.
This is one of German method where you construct the bed with a drainage underneath with leaf mold and compost and topsoil on the top, little trough for watering and having it infiltrate. That's like a construction of a bed. But if we just dig the bed, just by digging the bed, we're bringing air into the soil. And that raises the bed. And as we shape it, it could be a slightly rounded. And if you have a heavy soil, so you have a clay soil, or like here where we are silty, heavy, sticky soil, then by raising it slightly, it will drain better in spring and autumn when it's wetter, and it warms up better, and it has a better metabolism, meaning the soil organisms will be healthier. Whereas if you have a very sandy soil, you might want to just dig it as a level bed and not expose it too much light and warmth, because it dries out naturally very fast. So you want to be aware of your soil type, your soil texture. If it's sandy soil, if it's a loamy soil or silty or clay soil, and that you can basically just very easily assess by taking a bit of soil, kneading it, and then making little sausages that you feed through the forefinger and the thumb. And the longer the sausage is, if it's say 5 centimeters is a clay soil, if it's only 3 centimeters, 2 centimeters is silty soil, and if it doesn't stick at all, it's a sandy soil. So you can do a rough assessment like that yourself about what soil type you got. Depending on that, you want to have more of a raised bed or more of a flat bed.
Okay, so you want a raised bed if it's clay?
Yeah.
And then rough if it's sandy.
So level, all level if it's sandy, so it's not exposed to more light and warmth that just drains it and dries it out faster.
Okay.
In the beginning, until we have built up soil fertility over a few years, then you can also do raised beds.
Okay. So we've chosen the plot, we have taken the turf off, and we have now decided how we're going to orient the beds and whether we're going to raise them or not.
Yeah.
What happens next? What about the seed and all those things?
As you said already, you're pretty limited. You got 3 square meters in the front, 6 square meters in the back. You got 9 square meters. Now, a family, or say an individual, let's start with an individual. Typically, if they have a healthy vegetable diet, and say they eat their 80% of their diet vegetables, which is the most recommendable amount of proportion vegetables to proteins, say legumes or meat or whatever people eat, depending on if they're meat eaters, carnivores, or vegetarians, vegans. For that, to provide vegetables for one person, you need about 100 square meters.
100 square meters. God.
Yeah. Now, that is assuming that you want to grow your own fertility. So a third or a quarter of your garden needs to be dedicated to growing green manures. Green manures are plants that fix nitrogen, and they, over a short period of time, accumulate a lot of organic material that you can dig back into the soil and manure the soil with that green manure.
Like yarrow
if you have,
stuff.
like
yarrow.
Like, for example, vetch or tares, as they're called also. They're a legume plant. They're a winding, climbing plant. You grow that together with oats or Hungarian ryegrass, so a grass. The two together create a huge mass of roots. The legume accumulates the nitrogen, and if you dig them in together when they're young and green, before they get stalky, they give you a huge amount of available nutrition for the vegetable plants that you subsequently will grow in that area. And we can come to how you rotate that at a later point. But basically, to say, depending on your size plot, obviously you will supply more vegetables or less to you or your family. So for a family, I would say you need at least 200 square meters, because once you really the more you learn how to grow, the less area you will need. And as you keep growing, also the fertility usually will grow if you care for the land biodynamically, and you will need less area. But to start with, that's roughly what you would need. Yeah, if you produce your own fertility. If you import the fertility, you need much less.
Yeah. Okay. So that was slightly shocking for me, because I'm thinking I probably have a slightly bigger garden than most people, or an average sort of size garden, where I am at least. I know that some people in London and in some of the cities would have even less than that. But you know, I could probably get like about 15 square meters of something where I am. Many people will have less than that. There may be people who have got more than that as well. So I wouldn't be able to provide for all my needs, basically. But
not on that size of garden.
But at the same time, if I grow my own food, then I may have more to get by with than if I just rely on buying everything on the supermarkets where there isn't any food at the moment.
Not only that you get by with more, you know, just what you got there, you will have food that's more nutritious. It will have a higher fiber content. You will need to eat less than anything that's organically or conventionally grown outside of your control, because it will not have the fiber you need for your gut bacteria to actually grow a healthy gut biome, to boost your immune system, to nourish you well, to inform you well with the light information you need to keep you healthy. And the other thing is the nutrient content in your vegetables, the way you're going to grow it, is much higher than anywhere else in a conventional or commercial plot of organic or conventional growing, or maybe even biodynamic, because they still have to be a commercial enterprise, whereas you are having very low inputs. So the plants fend for their life. They might be yielding less, but more concentrated in nutrition. So you might need to eat less. Combine that with, for example, restricting your intake to 2 meals a day instead of 3. And you will have a great supplement of vegetables that are very health-giving. So that's why I said in the beginning, anything you can grow on your own at home in a loving, caring way, which is another aspect that feeds the plants with more information that's healing for you and the environment, is going to benefit the family.
Yeah, of course.
And we stay away from big crops that, you know, crops like potatoes that use a lot of area, which I wouldn't recommend anyway for 40% of people to eat because of their poisons that cause rheumatoid arthritis in a lot of people nowadays, and chronic inflammation. So they use most of the area. So you concentrate on plants that are taking up less space, and then you know, you start intercropping, you start companion planting, and filling the space with more plants, and you would actually then have even more than what I said to you would get.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm talking about the initial start for someone who's a beginner. You know, that's the realistic figure to start with.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so again, we want to make this sort of highly practical, and so let's say, for example, somebody is just watching this video and they have decided that they are going to start the garden tomorrow morning, and so tomorrow morning they go and choose the plot. It may take them, I don't know, half an hour or something like that to decide where they're going to create this. They go and they take the turf off. They think how they're going to sort of, you know, whether they're going to have raised beds or whatever. That's taken them, 2 or 3 hours, something like that, depending on the size of the garden. So they've now got a plot that hasn't got the turf. It's all ready. And what do they need next? Presumably they need to think about what they're going to grow.
Yeah. So just as you said, it will take them some time to do this. In your case, for example, with roughly 12 square meters, you're looking probably at preparation time, taking the turf off, setting it up as a compost, digging over the ground, which for that you will need a digging fork. It's healthier to do a digging fork because there's less resistance for the tines to get in the ground and dig the ground.
So you're digging what, to create the beds?
To create the beds, to aerate the soil, to then being able to crumble it, to create a seed bed and a planting bed. So you have to create that to bring the air in, the soil activates, the soil life becomes active. Just like us, if we start deep breathing, we oxygenate the cells and it can perform on a higher level and create more warmth and more metabolism, and therefore create more energy and more performance. Same happens in the soil. If we dig it open, then we activate the soil to actually perform better and give more nutrients to the plants. So digging it over might take another, I would say probably if you think of a work day of 8 hours, particularly for a novice, for a beginner, I would say 1.5 days.
Right.
To be realistic. Okay.
Okay.
So just
so
to give you
a couple of days work there.
It's not going to be Gardener's World. You know, you see a film in 1 hour and they do it all in 1 hour and create a whole garden. It will take you time.
Okay.
So once you've done that.
So I take the gardening fork in, put it all the way in, right?
As deep as the topsoil is.
Yes.
So you need to ascertain that you distinguish between the brown topsoil and the light colored subsoil, because you don't want to bring any subsoil up to the top. That destroys the structure, and it will stop the soil from breathing. We want a breathing soil, so we want to keep the layers in place.
Okay. So when I've done my gardening before, I've got the fork pretty much all the way in. You dig it out and you end up with a big lump, because I think it's quite clay here. So you end up with quite a big lump of soil, and then you crumble it into smaller bits and so on. And it's all quite dark. I am not aware of having seen a layer that is lighter than that.
You're very lucky you got a very rich soil, and some farmers say the richest farmer is not the one who has got the biggest extension of land. So if your soil is really deep, you want to look at the size of your plot and also the depth. So in your case, you would probably grow more per square meter than someone who's got a very shallow soil that might be only 15 centimeters, 6 inches deep. Right. So you're very lucky. You're on a very rich soil. Yeah.
Okay.
So for someone who is on in Brighton or on the North Downs near London, and they're on the Downs with this chalk underneath. Yeah. I mean, we did some soil samples in Croydon, and you know, after almost 4 inches, 5 inches, you start hitting the rock. Yeah, it's very shallow.
Okay. Yeah. So you've chosen the plot. You've done all that. You begin to turn the topsoil. That may take you, let's say, a day and a half. Okay, so you've done all that. Presumably, then you need to start thinking about what you are going to grow.
Yes, you want to start thinking about that. The later you dig your soil, also you want to be thinking of following up, depending how fast your soil dries, to take the fork and tilth the soil, the top layer maybe 2 inches, and crumble it, because you now have big blocks of soil from digging, and you might have to crumble it down very finely to sow directly for your root crops, for example, or lettuces or whatever you want to sow directly. And the finer, the smaller the seed, the smaller the crumb structure has to be. So you have to like follow up 2 or 3 times after digging, go in with your fork and beat the soil gently, like in a rotary fashion, like a rototiller does, and beat it and crumble it. And do that not in one go, but you have to go maybe 2 or 3 times in there, and might take another 4 hours of work.